Now, what I'd like to do is show some slides. May I have this?
Yes.
Just show some slides. This is very, very quick about some of the drawings that have been done, some of the faces. Now, I told you the story about the man whose only recollection was a dread of a certain stretch of highway, one of the major, a dread of a certain place was very common. This is a drawing made by Ted Jacobs, who I also introduced to Whitley Strieber, and he had Ted do the drawing for his cover of his book. It's a pastel. But the man that I had been describing had Ted make the drawings of these figures. Now it's interesting, almost everybody, when they finish the drawing or have the drawing done, they look at it and say, it's sort of right, but it's not quite right. It never seems to be exactly on target. It's an odd thing. But that's a typical example. Now, this we'll have to get back a little bit to see together. The drawing on the right was done by Kathy Davis. The one on the left was drawn by a woman from North Carolina who had a UFO experience. When I was giving a lecture one time and showed that slide, the woman who had made the drawing on the left had never seen the one on the right, and she took one look at the two together and came up to me after the lecture, and tears are running down her face, and she said how shocked, horrified she'd been when she saw this. She said, you know, but I don't want to believe that happened to me, that it really happened to me. But seeing the figure on the right sort of cemented to her the idea that they're being so similar that, in fact, she had encountered these people. We're describing figures, again, who are roughly, the descriptions run from very small, 3 feet or so, to maybe up to almost 5 feet. This is a drawing involving a case in Canada, and the woman gave us a nice side view to show that the eyes wrapped around the side. Now, her conscious recollection of her abduction is interesting. She remembered, and this is part of the vagaries of recollection in these cases, it's as if the wiping out of the memory is an imperfect science as far as they're concerned. They seem to be able to block the memory, but not always exactly. This woman remembered.
Maybe they don't want to.
Maybe they don't want to, but it's worked in a very odd way where one man had an abduction experience which involved a missing time period of about 2 hours, but subsequently he forgot all the events of the whole week. It's as if, and yet he was going about his business. He went to work, he came home, and his family were in touch with him and so forth. But it's as if they gave him a little overdose of anesthetic, and it took everything else with it, along with the abduction experience. But this woman awoke. She was, I believe, 8 or 9 years old. I've forgotten. She woke up in the middle of the night in a farm near Toronto, outskirts. Found herself absolutely compelled to go downstairs and go outside. And she walked out not knowing where she was going, and walked down a road. She knew exactly where she had to go, walked up a field, and she saw this illuminated square form against a black mass, and it turned out to be a doorway in an object, and there were these two little people standing there, and she knew that she had to walk right inside, again, as if she was compelled. And she remembers that now this is all conscious recollection, that she was to get on this table. And she took one look at the table and this implication of helplessness and so forth, and said, no way am I getting on that table. And the next thing she knew, she was walking back up the road to the house. And she remembered all of that consciously. Of course, the part she didn't remember is that she ended up on the table. Many times people think that they have won this little battle, and in fact they haven't. This is a drawing, a 3/4 head, and this is a case in Erie, Pennsylvania. This woman awoke she'd had many experiences, it's quite complex, but one rather bizarre one. She awoke hearing a strange sound outside the window, and there was a tree branch outside. She remembered the tree branches shaking and jumping, and as if she heard something walking on the roof. Then the next thing she knew, she was back in bed and had no recollection of what happened, except that the branches were broken. There was something very strange that had occurred. Under hypnosis, the craft had come directly down next to the window, her bedroom window, second-story window. She was taken out the window into the craft, and under hypnosis, the way the scene ended, they put her back on the windowsill, the second-story window, and she remembered sitting on the windowsill and watching this thing moving away, and then looking around and realizing that here she is in her nightgown up there. How did she get there, as the memory had been taken away? This is interesting because it's a three-quarter head, and we don't have too many of those. Now, this is a little sculpture by Kathy Davis, the central figure in Intruders, and she made it of ceramic afterwards, and we had a meeting once of our support group, and Kathy had brought this along, and she had it sitting on a little counter, and when the first couple of abductees walked in, everybody sort of jumped looking at it, didn't like looking at it, and finally a woman who was rather fiery of temperament marched straight over to it and wrapped both her hands around its skinny little neck, and it went like that. And it was enormous. Everybody felt this great sense of relief. But I said it was their thought, but they were still afraid to go over. And incidentally, the kind of terror that people feel is so unreasoning to someone who hasn't had the experience. One man who's a very big, burly man said to me, "Bud, if I were in my bed and I have a gun on my bed table and I saw them come in the door," which had happened to him in his bedroom, and the gun was there, he said, "I'd pick up the gun and kill myself."
Not them.
Not them, himself. Because the terror was that great.
But you just said it had happened to him?
This had actually happened without the gun. He didn't have a gun at the time. One detail, but I mean, that's the level of terror, and I've heard this from other cases, and I have at least 3 cases where I'm absolutely convinced that a person was tipped over the edge into suicide because of their UFO experiences. That level of terror is very, very powerful. Now, the thing about the Kathy Davis head, which is really kind of charming, I said, "Kathy, why do you have the head inclined back, looking like that?" And she said, "Well, that's why I always see him. He's only this big, and he's always looking up at me." It's realism. This is a drawing of a case that occurred actually in the Bronx, New York. I have within Manhattan itself some abductions. A craft has come down perfectly black, dark at night, right above a building, and a person has taken up a beam right out through their apartment building or whatever. In one case, a man and his sister, whose parents, incidentally, the father is extremely well known in theatrical areas. The father and mother were putting Christmas presents under the tree and so on and so forth, and suddenly this man, the abductee I was working with his sister, they were a little tiny, perhaps 3 and 5 years old, were just somehow floated out of their beds into the room where the parents were, and the parents were frozen, unable to move, and as if they're in suspended animation. We get this in many cases. And this man and as a boy and his sister were taken up a beam of light into the craft. And under hypnosis, it was extraordinarily touching because his sister was on another table and she was being examined and was crying, and he was trying to comfort her, even though he was only, say, 5 years old or 6 years old. But when he first got in this place, not knowing what was happening, it was Christmas Eve, under hypnosis, and this is a grown man reliving it as if he were a child. There's this long silence, and he suddenly says, "Where's Santa Claus?" and bursts into tears, sobbing and sobbing. He knew that somehow it was magical. It had some property of, he didn't know whether it was Santa Claus was involved or what. But anyway, this drawing was made by a man whose experience, a different person, occurred in the Bronx, New York. I have people from all the boroughs of New York City.
What do you think of this selection process? Obviously, these people are chosen and pre-selected. And could they be of descendants of an evolution or even reincarnated of individuals who had been with those spacecraft 10,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago?
I suppose anything is possible. We have tried to do psychological testing of varying sorts, interviews and so on, to look for any patterns in these people. The patterns that we've gotten psychologically are very similar, according to psychologists, of the sorts of deficits that turn up in tests done with rape victims. A sense of lowered self-esteem, a sense of great fear about the outer world, and a sense of not trusting their own bodies, their own physicality.
Have you ever taken a subject and regressed someone who's had multiple abductions to the next previous lifetime and gone back to see if in that incarnation they had also been abducted?
I've never gotten involved in doing past life hypnosis. I take my mysteries one at a time.
A Canadian abductee, a woman, when asked the question of, why were you chosen? Why is anybody chosen? Her response was that they told her that they could tune in easier to certain kinds of people than others, implying that there's some kind of electromagnetic or other way of monitoring people to see who they can control or communicate with or whatever. Have you heard that kind of thing? It's from the same woman you talked about before, but...
I would not believe anything I hear from an alien any more than I would believe anything I hear from Ed Meese.
I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying there's a certain degree of sense in the notion that when you scan, if you find somebody you can tune in on easier, that makes the job easier.
But why can you tune in? Is it a genetic tie? What's the link?
See,
there's got to be a link.
Elizabeth, the big thing is that we're dealing with people who are being tracked because of their genetic position. In other words, that they are the daughter or son of somebody who has already been abducted. So we're going across generations. It doesn't seem to be random that way. I mean, they definitely seem to lock on to people who are in a certain bloodline, which connects it with a physical thing more than, let's say, a psychological or spiritual thing, although that may be involved. But certainly the physical thing seems to be very central to it. Now, earlier, as a matter of fact, Linda said something about locations. At certain times, things happen in a certain area. It also works completely the other way around, too. That I have one abductee who I've been working with, a young woman, who was abducted in Ohio, where she was born as a little child, several times. She went to Spain and was abducted in Spain. And she also was in South America, in Argentina, was abducted there. So it didn't make a difference where she went. She was being tracked. This slide we have here is from a drawing made by a woman who was shown evidently at the nursery where these little fetuses are developed. The figure at the left was her idea of the more adult figure, and the little fetus in the foreground, fetus-like thing. She later said that the body is too small in proportion to the head. But these are rather ugly and rather terrifying, to put it mildly, and the little tank is the object at which the thing was floated. Now, one of the details I kept out of my book are descriptions of the nursery where these little babies are developed, which are very similar, and I have in a number of cases, and so we've had people fill in. Incidentally, one thing about the drawings, a man who contacted me a while ago, he did not know I'd written a book or anything about this, remembered everything consciously without hypnosis, and this is many of these cases. He came to my studio, and finally when I won his confidence and he began telling me things that had happened to him, he said, "Bud, they put something up my nose, made my nose bleed." And he said, "I was only 5 years old." He said, "I remembered them sticking." He said, "Have you ever heard of that?" And I said, "Well, maybe 50 or 60, 70, 80 times. He was stunned to find out that. At any rate, I had him make a drawing of the figure that he recalled, having been in the craft. He sat down very carefully making this drawing. And when he finished it, it was so much like the others. I opened my book, Intruders, which he did not know about. And he came up with many details in this account that had not been printed in Intruders. And I had absolutely no reason to doubt him. I showed him the book, showed him these pictures. I just slid it over to him on the table. He took one look, his eyes hit those pictures, and he jumped like that, and then burst into tears. And this is a man, I would say, in his middle 30s, married, very substantial businessman, but he sobbed and sobbed. It was such a horrifying shock. He said, "Where did you get those pictures?" And I said, "I got them the same way I got your picture." And I apologized for showing it to him so quickly. But he showed me a scar on his leg. He remembered them cutting his leg when he was a little boy. And he said, "Have you ever heard of anything like that?" And I said, "Yes, I have." These are two scars on the calf, the front of the calf, of Kathy Davis. These are what we call the scoop marks. They're little round, they're smaller than your little fingernail, and they're distinct depressions as if a little, almost like ice cream scoop tool was used to remove layers of cells. They were done at 2 different times. I'll show you a close-up of what they look like. Doctors have been extremely interested in these because one doctor asked her if she had ever had a bone marrow sample taken or couldn't figure out what caused this little depression. Now, this is the leg of her mother. Talk about the generations. This is a close-up in another light of the mark on her mother's leg, the scoop mark here. 2 generations of the same family. This is a little harder to see. I hope everybody, if we zoom in a little bit. There's a straight line cut to one side and the scoop mark down at the end of it. This occurred, just to show you the distribution of this, on the leg of a woman who is now about 32 years old, and this occurred when she was about 4, living in France. This is a French abduction. Same exact thing happening. This is a close-up of a scoop mark on the back of a man who was abducted from Brooklyn. This man's mother is an American and black, and his father is from Pakistan. And there seem to have been other experiences, abductions in that family. It's not yet been thoroughly explored. This is the scoop mark on yet another case. It's sort of unfortunate to be sitting. I think this is probably enough. We can turn off the slides. Sitting here looking at scars is not the most pleasant thing, but I don't know whether it's better than looking at Linda's carcasses. I have to think about that. One of the things.
Sort of the same.
This isn't all fun, what we do here.
You know, I'd like to comment on the terror that you are describing. Generations of young men have gone to war, died on the battlefield. People pass on heroically from terminal diseases or traumatic things. And death is not so great a terror as you have described. And therefore, what terror could be greater to the human psyche than death?
One man told me, one man said the following thing. This is a chemist who was abducted. He said, Budd, he went up some kind of a beam right out of his car and was brought down into this room from the top of the room. This is very unusual. Usually it's through the floor. And as he's being lowered down, he said, standing on this floor, looking up, are these little gray figures, more or less identical, just looking up at him dispassionately. There's a table. It's very clear he's headed for the table. And he said, Budd, I didn't know what or who they were looking at me. I had no idea what they were. There was no emotion, no way to read it. They weren't standing there with, like they're about to attack him and do something, where you might actually get some kind of adrenaline going and fight back. They're just dispassionate, just staring. He said, I didn't know where I was, what this room was, that I was just now being transported into it. And he said, and my body didn't work. I couldn't even get an arm up to my face. And he said, every single familiar thing had been taken away from me. My surroundings, my fellow man, my ability to move my arm, every single familiar thing was gone. And he said, when every familiar thing is gone, you know an absolutely bottomless terror. Because there's nothing to relate it to. Another man told me in another case, he said, you know, but I had 2 things happen to me terrible last year. He said, my father died after a long illness, and he said, I had a major setback in my career. And these were both very disturbing. But he said, I was kind of prepared for them. You sort of understand that it's going to happen and so forth. And he said, I could take them. But this experience, an abduction, he said, there was nothing in the world to prepare me for it. I had no idea from moment to moment what was going to happen next. He said, with a mugger, if a guy has a gun on you, and you're fishing for your wallet and trying not to look him in the eye so you don't, to avoid that, you can at least, you hear the cars going by, you hope somebody might show up, and you know that if the mugger runs away in 2 minutes without having shot you, you're probably all right. You know certain things. He said, I had nothing to go on, not a single solitary thing. And that sense of unknown, that sense of profound terror, is just beyond the pale. Now, one last thing, and then I'm going to end this because I don't want to go on awfully late, but it's an interesting thing. There's something I call the skeleton key effect. And that is that when a person realizes that he or she has had these experiences, that knowledge unlocks a lot of strange behavior in that person's life that the person himself, herself, has never really understood. Why I have had such and such a peculiar terror about something or other, a certain place, or certain phobias, or certain kinds of behavior. One man I was talking to about this the other day, and somebody said they didn't like to be touched in a certain place, actually the region of the navel, because there had been these needles inserted in the abdomen. And he said, isn't that funny? He said, the one thing I can't ever stand is somebody to touch me lightly like this. He said, that I just totally fall apart. He said, I want a real touch. But this just drives me nuts. And of course, he's remembering these little hands, these little strange fingers that have moved.
Webbed hands.
There's a man who is a police officer, and he told me that he had had this phobia about being terrified of spiders. He said, black widow spiders, he said, I've hated them and I've been afraid of them. And he said, that's my only phobia. And I said, well, a lot of people have phobias like that. And he said, well, I remember how this started. And I had just asked him about phobias without necessarily connecting with UFOs. And I said, well, a lot of people have spider phobias. And he said, well, mine started when I was 5 years old. I was sleeping in my little bed right next to the window. I remember I woke up in the middle of the night, and right in the corner of the window was a spider's nest with a couple of black widow spiders in it. And he said, I was so scared, and I pulled the blanket over my head, and he said, I just huddled there, and in the morning I just screamed for my mother, and I asked her to take away the spider's nest. And she said, there's nothing there in the window. And he said, there was nothing there. I couldn't figure it out. And he said, my mother explained that black widow spiders don't build nests in a sunlit area like a window. They go under porches and back under things. And he said, from that moment on, developed this terrible fear of black widow spiders, and I would go out looking for them to kill them. He said, I was scared of them, but I wanted to kill them. And I would get stones, and I would go back under decks and places, and I would find them, and I would smash them. And he said, this went on for years. He said, this is a guy who's had been involved in gun battles. He said, still to think of them scares me, and I hate them. And I said, I don't understand this thing about this white nest, spider's nest. I'm thinking a great big open web, He said, it was just one of those white spider's nests. And I'm thinking, I just don't know enough about spiders, I guess. I didn't understand. He said, it was right in the corner of the window. And I said, well, how many black widow spiders were in it? And he said, 2. He said, they were very shiny and black. He said, they were just like this.
Oh.
And when he went like that, he looked at his hands, and he did that. He just, it just hit him extremely powerfully. There's a man who was lifted up in a light beam as a little boy into a UFO abduction experience, a typical story. And he said, now as he explored this and got into it and other things, he said he remembered something that was extraordinarily upsetting to him when he was a little boy, sad to him, not upsetting. He said the Venetian blinds were at a slant, and this beautiful light beam, sunbeam, was coming through the Venetian blinds. And he had a little toy soldier, and he was quite small. This is right after this experience. He picked up a little toy soldier, held it in the light beam, and let go, and the thing fell to the floor. And he couldn't figure it out. He was very upset. He picked it up and held it in the sunbeam 2 or 3 times, let go, and each time, of course, it fell to the floor. And he went in crying to his mother that the beam wasn't holding the soldier. Couldn't understand why that would be. She had no idea why it should hold the soldier. He, of course, knew. This boy said that the first time he was taken around that time to a large office building where there was an elevator, he got in the elevator with his mother, and he said, it's not going fast enough. It's too slow. It's not going fast enough. And she said, but you've never been on an elevator before. He said, I know, but they go faster than this. And then when the doors opened on the 12th floor and he stepped out, he said, we're still in the building. And she couldn't understand where all this was coming from. But the point is, this skeleton key effect, this is just a touching on the situation. It's usually much more profound than these are little light examples. But it's as if people who had these experiences had been leading secret lives that they knew nothing about. And if they had been abducted 10 or 20 or 30 times, they're conditioned by these experiences. We are working on ways in which they can begin to regain a sense of their own power, to regain the illusion of control or something. It's very, very difficult, but the problem must be addressed. And in the meantime, I'm in the position of working with people just to get them through the trauma and try to explore what's happened. And as I said earlier, my sense of myself is that I've been so busy in the emergency room running around with the Band-Aids and the tourniquets that I haven't had a chance to approach the public health issues that we really have to address to see what can be done. But it is a central problem right now. The abduction situation may involve hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, maybe larger numbers than that.
Thank you. Thank you, Budd.